to week 8 of English 121. Alright, well now it's time, guys, to move on to poetry. Just a reminder that your fiction papers are due today, that's Wednesday, March 12th by 11:59 p.m. So please make sure you get in your final drafts of your paper. Hopefully you can hear me this time. Sorry about the technical difficulties last week. There was something wrong with my home computer where I was recording the lecture. So hopefully that won't happen again. I'm recording this at school. So this week I'd like you to begin by watching this lecture, please. I'm going to be providing an introduction to poetry, and we're going to be talking about chapter 13, which is reading a poem, and that's found on pages 673 to 686. You're going to be also close reading a poem by Elizabeth Bishop called One Art, and that's found on page 985. There's also a film clip associated with this that you'll find under the Reflection Journal. Then for our conversation this week, you're going to be looking through the poems for further reading in chapter 33, and you're going to find a poem to close read and introduce to the rest of the class. Alright, well, let's start by thinking about what is poetry. A lot of people are concerned about reading poetry. They think, oh, I don't understand it, it's so complicated, it's not like fiction, it's not straightforward. But I think as you're starting to notice, any sort of literary writing, such as the short stories by Flannery O'Connor, the short stories, Sonny's Blues, some of these stories that we've read in the last few weeks are so complex. We tend to dive into them more easily because they're written in prose, but some of these are much more complicated than any of the poems we're going to be reading over the next few weeks. So know that you already have the skills to read a poem, and you should feel confident about your abilities. We do poetry as the second unit because I like you guys to build up your confidence first before we begin reading close reading poetry. So why don't you start by watching Reading a Poem. It's a video on our interactive e-text that just talks about the process of paraphrasing and as a way to gain an understanding of a poem. But the first thing I want to introduce to you is the idea that you don't really need to answer the question, what is poetry? That is a giant thing to answer. And instead, what I want you to focus on is I want you to study the poems that we're going to be reading over the next few weeks. And I want you to let them grow in your mind after every single reading. One of the gifts of poetry comes from the expression to learn by heart. The idea of taking a poem in doesn't mean you're going to have to memorize a poem for this class, but the idea is you take a poem in so that you know it so well that it's part of your heart. It's part of your own being. And there are many poems I've had the great gift of knowing over my lifetime, and many of them I know in that way. They change. Great poems change every time you read them. You find new pieces in them. You find new ideas in them, and they mean something different to you because you're at a different time in your life. So one thing to do is to give poems a chance to open up inside your mind, and sometimes it takes a while. For the next few weeks, we're going to just be learning this study of poetry. I want you to learn how to look at a poem closely, and I'm going to be introducing to you the vocabulary that you need just in order to express what you feel a poem means. Just like in short stories, you're able to argue a theme based on using different things that you find, different, characters, different situations, different symbols you find in a short story. It's the same for a poem. When you read a poem, you're going to be looking for things that help you understand a reading. And finally, I'm going to offer you a plethora of amazing poems to read and hopefully understand. So, how do you go about reading a poem? The first step in reading a poem is to read it closely. And when I say read it closely, I want you to first read it straight through. Okay, just read it through. Don't worry about all the words. And then go through it looking for the sense of the poem, meaning read it slowly and try to understand it word by word, line by line. If there are words in the poem you don't understand, you want to look them up. And you want to try to figure out which words are important. Are there words that are repeated? And another thing that really helps in this stage is to read the poem aloud. You'll actually hear it completely differently. Then you want to restate the poem, or write some sort of state the poem's literal meaning as a paraphrase that you write in prose. You'll never be able to write a poem's meaning just as beautifully as it was written as a poem, but the idea is that you can tell me what you think the poem is about, and you just want to reread that after you write it to make sure that you haven't missed anything important. So there's two major types of poems that we're going to be looking at this semester. The first is probably the most popular nowadays, and that's the lyric poem. Originally, a lyric was an ancient Greek form, and it was poetry that was written to be sung with a lyre. And if you see that picture up above, that's the poet Sappho, who maybe some of you have heard of before. I wrote my dissertation on the poetry of Sappho and the poetry of Amy Lowell and how they were related. Sappho wrote lyric poetry that was sung at parties, right? Instead of having a band, you would have Sappho come with her lyre, and she would sing poems that she had written. Nowadays, though, a lyric is just a short poem that expresses thoughts and feelings of a single speaker. It is not, doesn't rhyme like the lyrics maybe of a song. Sometimes it'll rhyme, but it's rarely a rhyming form. The key is that the poem uses all of the different tools like imagery and metaphor and simile that we're going to be talking about over the next few weeks in order to express the thoughts and feelings of a single speaker. Some examples of lyric poetry is One Art by Elizabeth Bishop, which we're going to be close reading this week. And another one we're going to be close reading this week is called The Lake Isle of Innisfree, and that's by William Butler Yeats. Now, narrative poetry was originally used to write epic poems to tell the long cultural history of a war or a great hero. Some examples of this are Homer's Odyssey and the Iliad. But the main purpose of narrative poetry is very straightforward. It's to tell a story. Again, it's a poem, so it's telling the story with the purpose of expressing, the emotional residue that's attached to that story, the emotional landscape that surrounds that story. So an example of this is Robert Frost's Out, which is found in our book, I believe on page 680. So I'd like you guys to take a look at the Lake Isle of Innisfree, and that's found on page 675. There's if you look at the e-text, there's an audio clip of someone reading the poem, which I feel like it's really important with this poem. But also there's a video that talks about the interpretation of the poem. It begins with X.J. Kennedy reading the poem, and then an interpretation of the poem, which is really worth reading through. I'd also like you to look at the biography of William Butler Yeats, because it's important to know that he's an Irish poet. When this poem was written, 1892, and what that meant to William Butler Yeats. He actually wrote this when he was not in Ireland. He was in England, and he was thinking about this place from far away. This is a lyric poem, so it's a single person's reflection about his thoughts and feelings about this place. But the information is not just given to tell us about the place. It's also it's a very personal explanation in order to tell us more about how this person feels. And what's amazing about poetry is the more specific you get in poetry, he's so specific in his description of this place, so like the Lake Isle of Innisfree, the more universal it becomes, meaning the more that you and I can relate to his feelings about this place. So please go through and closely read this poem. I highly suggest reading it aloud because of the music of the lines, but also watch the video and try to really form your own practice understanding the close reading of this poem. Walk away with some sort of a paraphrase of what the meaning of this is, so you can really find the theme, like what is the speaker's purpose for reflecting on the Lake Isle of Innisfree from far away, and especially found in the last few lines of the poem where he's standing, while I stand on the roadway or on the pavement's gray, I hear it in the deep heart's core. So the reason why he's feeling this in his deep heart's core. Alright, well this week what we're going to be doing for our conversation is I'd like you to practice close reading. I'd like you to choose a poem from chapter 33, Poems for Further Reading, and offer a close reading of this poem. You're going to begin by reading the poem straight through. Then you're going to read it for sense. You're going to read it slowly and try to understand every single word. Then you're going to restate or paraphrase what the poem is about. Finally, I want you to explain why you chose this poem. How did it speak to you? What about it spoke to you? And then, as always, I'd like you to respond to at least 3 of your peers. Maybe by reading their descriptions of poems, you're going to go back and look for other poems. Try also to be original. Try to choose a poem that no one else has chosen. And also, please make sure you post your first post by Saturday at 11:59 p.m. This is just another friendly reminder that at 11:59 on Wednesday, your final paper is due. This is your paper on Flannery O'Connor's short story. All right. For your reflection journal, I would like you to watch the video clip from In Her Shoes, where Carmen Diaz reads One Art by Elizabeth Bishop, and I will post that under the content this week. I'd like you to also turn to page 985 and closely read the poem yourself. Use the skills you've gained this week to write about what the poem is about. Tell us, what has the speaker of the poem lost? Why does she repeat lines in this poem? What words are repeated? Why do you think they're repeated? How does the poem make you feel? And why do you think it makes you feel this way? Alright, that's it for this week, you guys. Get out there and read these poems and feel confident about your close reading skills. Next week we're going to be turning to talking about imagery, and I will be doing some close readings of poems showing you what the imagery is doing. Alright, I'll see you guys online.